Well, good afternoon. My name is Jan Verheke. Welcome to this second session in a series of webinars in which we discuss corporate due diligence. Last week, we discussed corporate climate transition plans in the context of the proposed corporate sustainability due diligence directive, CRD. And this week, we want to continue on these topics. Last week, we discussed it thoroughly, and we have seen that various initiatives have been taken to establish specific recommendations and good practices, so that these pledges that are promoted in the corporate level would not be greenwashing. Today, we will focus on the banking sector. In 2021, when the Commission published its strategy on the financing of transitions, the Commission declared that financial sector entities and supervisors are making efforts to capture climate and environmental factors in risk management systems and prudential capital requirements, but progress remains insufficient. And therefore, they would propose amendments to the framework as it exists. And so now we are there. There is a new directive to change the Capital Requirements Directive. And the Commission proposes mandatory plans and quantifiable targets to be developed by banks to address the risks arising from their potential misalignment with the transition trends towards a sustainable economy. Well, the question is it sufficient? And that's the discussion of today. And we have a list of excellent speakers today. Thierry Philippona is from Finance Watch. Anushka Hilke is from the Institute of Climate Economics. James Vaccaro is from Climate Safe Lending Network. And Herdy Knijp is from the Sustainable Finance Lab. Before entering into the discussion, some practical things. Underneath the screen, you will find a kind of question and answer button. And we wholeheartedly suggest that you put in some questions. So, and even if the questions are put in, then you can, with thumbs, you can make the signal that you like the question. So that's very important in order to get a lively debate. At the end of the session, I will tell some things. And one of the things is about reporting. There will be a YouTube thing made that will be published within a few days. That's our kind of report. And for the rest, we will use the knowledge that we gathered today for our future activities, of course. So let's start. First of all, I introduce Mr. Thierry Philippona. He serves as chief economist at Finance Watch, a Brussels-based NGO, since 2011, after a long career in the finance industry. He was a member of the board of the French Financial Markets Authority, where he chaired the Climate and Sustainable Finance Commission and the Market Consultative Commission, and he's also a member of the European Commission First Platform on Sustainable Finance between 2020 and 2022. And moreover, he's a member of the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group. He is there in the Sustainability Reporting Board, and he made a number of publications. Mr. Philippona, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be with you today. And I have the formidable privilege of starting this discussion. So we'll try to put things in context, really. I'm very happy to be with you. And I would say to think together, because this question of transition plans applied to the financial sector is really work in progress, which is why when I was given as a topic, to address, what banks' transition plans should consist of, should look like, I was really happy that the conditional was used. And why should we be using the conditional? Because there is no such thing as a very well-defined way of doing transition plans today. And as I will show maybe a bit of a big word, but try to show, everything needs to be written. The first thing to have in mind is the context we operate in. And you have to forgive me because I'm going to state one or two things that may seem obvious, but that we tend to forget when we speak, when we dive deeply into the technicalities of what a transition plan should look like, etc. The world as we being humankind run it is not sustainable. It's a fact. It's not me saying it. We're not well on this. We all know that, but let's not forget this. It's the IPCC. I mean, read the IPCC reports. Everything is in there, as we all know. That lack of sustainability has many implications. But when it comes to business, it has really two implications. It has implications for the non-financial sector, and it has implications, and I would say it has two levels of implications for the financial sector. The implication for the non-financial sector, they're well aware of the fact that we're talking about banks today, but banks at the end of the day are in the business of providing capital to the non-financial sector. Seems very, very high level. For the non-financial sector, transition plans should consist of looking at the impact of business on the outside world. In our sustainable finance jargon, that's what we call impact materiality, which is just a pompous word to say, look, inside out impact of business on the eco environment, and in this particular case on climate change of the business world. That's one thing. When we look at the financial sector, well, this is true for the non-financial sector as well, but there is another dimension that we're going to have to look into, which is the impact of the outside environment on the sustainability, as in on the stability of the financial sector. Because obviously, if climate change leads us to all the dreadful consequences that the IPCC describes, droughts, floods, huge migration of human beings, wars, pandemics, I'll stop here, rising ocean levels. Obviously, the economy will not fare very well. And the economy, and I'm using other statements as I like to do, and if that is the case, the impact on the financial sector will be humongous. So we need to look, and we being collectively, the community of people looking into this subject, on the impact of all this on the stability of the financial sector. One of the obvious missing dimensions of the current discussion, in my view, on transition plans for the financial sector in general and for banks in particular, is that we don't distinguish enough between inside out impact materiality and outside in financial materiality for the financial sector. When we, and I like to use that we because this is a huge community of regulators, legislators, NGOs, academics, you name it. When we collectively say we need transition plans, and I would say everybody agrees on that, what exactly do we want to achieve? Do we want plans to manage the risk on the financial sector, which is a true enough and big enough subject, or do we want plans to manage the impact of the economy? And obviously banks have very special role to play in the economy on the world. That is the first thing we need to address. Linking to, and conscious of time because we have so many topics to discuss, linking to the current Capital Requirement Directive that is currently on the table of the EU co-legislators in so-called trilogue phase after the adoption of a version of the text by the European Parliament. it strikes me that when I say me, it's pretty obvious that the one dimension that is starting to be addressed by the CRD is about the outside-in financial impact of climate change on the banking sector, which is a big question. But it's, you know, the point I'm making here, it's only part of the question. And basically the text on the table, and I will go very, very fast on what it contains because I, could spend 2 hours on it. First, it sets an obligation to develop plans. Interesting to see that, by the way, or to note, by the way, that the word transition plans is not used by the text, but it sets the obligation to develop plans. And there is a reference to the CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is another piece of EU regulation, which basically defines the reporting obligations of companies when it comes to sustainability. And it's really good. And at Finance Watch, we've been pushing to create a link between the Capital Requirement Directive and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in order to try to build something that will be coherent. That opens many questions, and hopefully we'll address them during our debate. The second thing that the text on the table provides for is the fact that transition plans should be brought under what is called in the jargon STREP. STREP is the acronym, there are a lot of horrible acronyms in this world, for Supervisory Review and Evaluation Process, which is basically a process by which bank supervisors sit down with banks, assess what they're doing, review their operations, the risks they're taking, and decide whether the rules in place are sufficient to cover the risk of that specific banking institution. So that's the second thing that's in the text, which is a good thing. Everything else being equal, I think there's a big limitation to this exercise, but better see it in than out, even though shouldn't found too great hopes on it, in my view. The third thing, which obviously is linked to the previous point, is that transition plans should be brought under supervisory powers, and that the detailed provisions on ESG risk management should be in the mandate of the European banking authorities, and that the European banking authorities should provide guidelines for those transition plans. One thing that is obviously delicate in this whole process is that when you see, for instance, the mission given to the European Banking Authority to monitor and address financial risks in the banking sector, I think it's Article 87, adds that the EBA, European Banking Authority, should do that in particular with the objective of climate neutrality. And then you start thinking, well, climate neutrality is about something different, is it not? Climate neutrality is about the impact of the economic world on the outside world. And if I were to, sometimes I like provoking, let's assume, I'm not saying it's the case because I don't think it's the case, but let's assume that planting trees is a good solution to combat climate change. So are we saying that planting trees are going to be a risk management tool for banks XYZ because it has a fossil fuel risk, because it has an exposure, has very large exposure, I'm making it up, or maybe I'm not, to fossil fuel reserves? And obviously you think, maybe this is not the best hedge for your financial risk. And Thierry, you're saying something seriously absurd here. So what I'm saying here is that I see in the text that is currently negotiated by our legislators a confusion between the two dimensions, or the two possible objectives, I should say, of transition plans, and that is not healthy. And why is it not healthy? Because obviously we run the risk of, the word washing is fashionable these days. So transition plan washing, and we're gonna say, hey, you know, we have transition plans, so the world is saved, and some people like to say that. And I think we all have, hence the interest of the discussion we're having today. We all have a big responsibility to bring rigor to this debate, because if we don't bring rigor, we won't go anywhere. None of us believes it's an easy one, but the least we can do is to be rigorous. Recently, there was a different but related debate in the Parliament. Finance Watch had made a proposal, and I'll give you a very concrete illustration of lack of rigor. Finance Watch had made a very concrete proposal that in a context of stranded assets, in other words, there is no plausible scenario under which fossil fuel reserves can prosper from a financial standpoint. Either they will remain under the ground and not be burned and lose their value, or they will be extracted, climate change will degenerate, and everything will lose their value, and fossil fuel reserves with them. So there's no possible scenario if you project yourself in 20, 30, or 40 years' time where fossil fuel reserves will prosper. In the face of that, what Finance Watch and also other organizations had proposed was so-called one-for-one equity financing. In other words, if you're going to be financing further expansions and explorations of fossil fuel reserves, given the fact that you will lose your money, there is no scenario under which you will not lose it, please fund it out of equity. Long debate, I'm not getting into the debate, but it was very interesting to see that one of the political groups had linked the amendments that had tabled for such a legislation or a rule to the fact that there would not be a transition plan in that bank. And if there were a transition plan, then you wouldn't need that full equity funding rule. Not getting into the debate now, because it's not the subject of our discussion today, whether it's the right idea or not. Obviously, I think it's the right idea, but we're not getting into the debate. I just want to point to the contradiction of that political group, because saying that if you have a transition plan and you continue to finance further expansion of to search for more fossil fuel reserves, then you're under control. If you think about it, it means nothing from a technical standpoint. It's even an absurdity. It's contradiction in terms. So this point, just to illustrate the necessity of rigor that we have. And obviously, and I will finish here, if you think inside out, impact materiality, you have to relate the bank transition plans to the transition plans of the non-financial companies it provides capital to. I mean, it's pretty obvious. It's not the bank itself that emits CO2, or very marginally so. It is the company it finances. So the transition plan, from an inside-out standpoint of a bank, has to be linked to the transition plans of the companies it provides capital to.
Okay.
I think I'll stop here. I just wanted to sort of plant a few points to feed the discussion that is starting now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Philippona. It was a very good introduction to the theme. You pointed to the importance of rigorousness. It's important. It's difficult to say this word. Inside out and outside in. Outside in would be kind of adaptation policy, and inside out would be kind of mitigation policy in a way. But it's very important to see the difference. I now give the floor to Ms. Anushka Hilke. She's program director of financial institutions at the Institute for Climate Economics, which is a non-profit organization that provides independent policy analysis on climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. She works on the integration of climate aspects in finance and investment in a broad sense, and she supervises projects related to climate risk analysis and portfolio alignment with climate objectives. Anushka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. I would like to start with a hypothesis. And I think we talked about, or today the subject is the credibility of these transition plan requirements for banks, notably. And I would start by saying that this credibility of transition plan should be actually in the interest of the banks themselves, to start with. Because many of them have taken publicly net zero commitments already in a voluntary manner. And it is, I mean, there is this simple question of reputational issues. They have taken these commitments, but they also need to ensure that these commitments are not considered misleading information to shareholders, because most banks are listed at the stock markets. So there is already some kind of regulation that applies to these voluntary commitments. However, many obstacles exist today for these institutions, even those who are truly committed to putting in place their commitments. And you have probably heard a lot about data issues, missing metrics, not knowing which are the right scenarios to use. And there are also a lot of internal barriers. But beyond these, there is a true problem here, because if you are trying to truly align your banking operations today with a 1.5 scenario, that simply means that you're reducing your profits. And that does not necessarily produce much of a positive impact for the climate. So that is a problem. So from our point of view, even those most committed banks have a problem of putting their commitments into practice. So we need something. So, and what banks need is they need a level playing field here, at minimum at the European level, in order to actually put their commitments into practice, and in order to be credible, ensure that these commitments are actually compatible with the science. We already mentioned the IPCC. So banks need a framework, a regulatory framework, in order to be able to actually put in place or operationalize their commitments. So what can be these enablers for credibility for a level playing field, and which also are somewhat realistic? So we've already, Jerry also already mentioned the supervisory review and evaluation process, which is very important. By integrating these transition plan obligations into that process, what would that do? So that would ensure a harmonized implementation across Europe, same rules for everyone. So we start with that level playing field. But also the process ensures actually that specificities of financial institutions can be taken into account. So it's the same rules, but it allows some flexibility to actually take into account the specificities of certain financial institutions. It is also a qualitative process. It allows for step-by-step implementation as progress is made on data, metrics, and all the different barriers that we've already mentioned. It sets a strong benchmark now. It shows banks where the journey is going, but it leaves space for innovation and building the right processes, developing the data that we need, etc. So that's important. It can also be used to actually require banks to contribute to making progress on these barriers. For example, by developing new processes that generate new data streams, so banks can become part of the solution and less be considered part of the problem. I think that's also something that banks may want to be seen as. Another important aspect in order to ensure this harmonized approach is that it needs to cover all banks' operations and clients. This is important, obviously, for credibility. And it avoids to shift the exposures to those operations which are not targeted by the regulation. So making sure everything is covered, which is also consistent with the idea that the whole economy needs to transform and not only the fossil fuel industry, right? And obviously, this would be implemented over time. As I said, that's the good thing about this SREP process. It allows implementation over time, but making it clear already that at the end of the story, all operations will be covered and all clients. And Thierry also mentioned the objective of the plan. So managing the financial risks on the one side and managing the climate impact on the other side. So how does climate affect banking operations? That's the financial risks. And how does banking operations affect the climate? That's the climate impact. So to date, banks really have difficulties. It's traditionally banks are only expected to manage their measurable financial risks. So not only there's a limitation to the financial risks, but also to measurable financial risks, which limits the scope quite a lot, because today we're actually not very well able to measure the financial risks related to the climate, which means that for the moment, there's not much reason to actually act, because in terms of what we're trying to measure, we're not finding much. So that does not give a lot of impetus to act. So, and on top, traditionally, they only use a very short time horizon to do that. So either, as they're not looking for a longer time horizon, they're either blind with regard to future risks, or they don't feel responsible with managing future risks, because banks can say, well, by that time, our portfolios will have changed, so we're not concerned, which then again gives the impression that banks can keep financing operations, as Thierry already said, that are clearly not aligned with any of the scenarios. And that they become part of the problem by building these future risks. So only an integrated management of financial risks on the one side and climate impacts on the other side can overcome this contradiction. And it's also important as financing the transition also comes with financial risks. Financing the transition is not a clear cut. We don't know which technologies actually, for some areas, we know which technologies will be winning, for others we don't. So it's inherently risky. And so we need to ensure that by pushing banks to financing the transition, we also enable them to manage the financial risks that go with that. And probably we'll need different approaches than what we are used to doing in financial risk management, where we normally create buffers, financial buffers. So putting aside capital in case there is a problem. But by putting aside capital, we also have less capital available to finance the transition. So we may need to find new ways of managing financial risks. And also that is an argument to ensure that we manage the climate impact and the financial risk in an integrated way and not separately. And that's why we need one plan that does it all. And obviously, lastly, we need to create coherence we've already talked about different pieces of regulation which apply to companies generally, such as the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and also the new directive on the discussion on due diligence. And so we need to ensure that we get a harmonized set of new requirements in order to build a coherent set of expectations that provide clarity on the roles and responsibility for the different actors in the transition, for companies and banks aligned. So maybe to conclude, banks need a level playing field at the minimum at the EU level, but we also need banks to finance the transition. So we need to do that in an integrated way.
Thank you very much, Anushka, for this clear and consistent message, which puts the level that what is necessary a bit higher. I will now give the floor to James Vaccaro. He's the Executive Director of Climate Safe Lending Network, an international multi-stakeholder collaborative dedicated to accelerating the decarbonization of the banking sector. It's all on my paper, you see. To secure a climate-safe world, the network brings together senior leaders and change makers within all kinds of organizations. And James is the strategist and the systems thinker with a background in sustainable finance. He also acts as a special advisor to Triodos Bank. So James, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Jan. Hi, everybody. I thanks for the introduction. I mean, I may maybe sort of focus on the fact that my background is as a strategist, and when we talk of transition plans, what we are talking about is a strategy. And the good news about a strategy is that you always have one, whether you like it or not, whether it's intentional or not, whether you think you're following your strategy that is written down or not, you always have one. As Henry Mintzberg says, emergent strategy is the things which you're making decisions every day. You always make decisions. Those collection of things become your strategy. Therefore, they also become your emergent transition plan. So we have to first of all break down your intentional transition plan from your emergent transition plan. Different ways of looking at it. One way of looking at it is, and I think as Anishka sort of said, it has to cover everything. In other words, it needs to be a climate lens on your corporate strategy. So everything has got an impact on climate. What is the climate impact of all that you do? Not just the ring fence of the nice things that you'd like to talk about in climate. And ditto, if you have a nature transition plan or a social transition plan, well, then it needs to be the nature lens on things which might also be generated because of your climate intentions, but they're all part of your corporate strategy. The risk of always having a strategy is that at any point in time, whether they're mandatory or not, you could, if asked as a bank to produce one tomorrow, go to the back room and say, hey, can we just get all the things which we've ever done with climate, just to, find on climate, collect that all together, put transition plan at the top, underline it and call it good. Now, who would know any different in terms of what are the expectations? What are we benchmarking this against? To what extent is a credible, good transition plan? What is it we're trying to kind of look for within this? And we've been looking at some of these questions within Climate Safe Lending Network, which I run, and also the UK Transition Plan Task Force, which is an advisory board. The UK was the first jurisdiction to say that it wanted to make transition plans mandatory. It has an advisory only body, Transition Plan Task Force, setting out some of the structures. It's a little bit like if you were revising for exams. It's like, here's how you write your essay. Here's how you should break up the paragraphs. Here's what you should include it. For full marks, here's what you should be doing. That is the nature of it. And it's being done in a way which is very logical. And it enables people who are strategists to go, yeah, this is how you would parcel up these different bits of work and bits of thinking and decision areas in a way which integrates and marries with other reporting protocols and regulatory expectations like TCFD, ISSB, all the other things coming from the regulatory regime. So in a way, the buzzword in the TPT has been interoperability. It is the word of the year 2023. But in terms of that interoperability, it only gets you so far. But building on the points that Thierry and Anishka have already made about materiality and the sort of the dominance at the moment of the single inward focus of financial materiality, and the fact that transition plans only make sense if you incorporate the secondary, the dual double materiality of what's happening to the climate system upon which the world, and by the way, the financial system is predicated. It only makes sense for a transition plan, which is all about carbon reduction pathways, to be done in that context. And yet there are definitely threats to this, and I've been picking up, especially in Europe right now, with where the status of the EFRAG recommendations will be. I mean, Europe's been at the lead in terms of being able to maintain the integrity of double materiality. If that is under threat, then what on earth does the transition plan mean otherwise? If it only means single materiality, a lot of the words no longer make sense. And in terms of the intentions behind them, they really get reduced to something which nobody has been designing in that way. What I think that will take place as you get more scrutiny of transition plans and more mandatory transition plans is that without some other mechanism to force disclosure on full coverage, on the specific, are these institutions really doing enough given their starting point and their context, then what you will probably get is, by default, selective reporting. You will get what is now referred to as green hushing, which is where they'll say, well, I'm not sure whether we should say this bit or not, because this is a bit of the sensitive area. There's a bill coming through the UK Parliament at the moment called the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act. It will give consumers far more powers on calling out financial institutions, in particular in areas where they're not following their own policies. So beyond just greenwashing. So will a bank really want to put out something which it feels like, oh, we might get called out on that one. Do we say it or not? Who is going to police the sufficiency and the comprehensive nature of the reporting? Who's going to police at all? Nobody yet knows who is going to be marking the homework for transition plans. There is a competence gap. There's competencies within central banks, and fair play to European Central Bank, who've been, I think, making a concerted effort to grow their capabilities, as have Bank of England. But they are not a scientific organization who can determine the latest science and the translation of that into flows, into being able to determine fair shares. That requires maybe some joint working. It requires maybe in the UK, Bank of England and the Climate Change Committee, who've only got advisory powers, to be able to maybe opine on, well, is this really good enough? The powers of central banks are useful because in the same way that they might in a SREP conversation say, hey, your senior managers regime, this isn't up to standard, have a capital add-on whilst you fix it. There's nothing quite like that for focusing the mind of any organization, especially unless it's what focuses the mind of banks in terms of doing something. In terms of strategy, whilst there is a lot of good work being done, I think, by the Transition Plan Task Force, and I think that there's a good source of thinking which is being shared with other jurisdictions on this structure, this kind of here's how to design your essay. A few pointers, complementary pointers from me on what would be a good strategy. Firstly, there needs to be context-based goals. So in order to be able to work out whether it's good or not, you need to be able to understand what is your starting position. Being able to say, yeah, we'll make cuts of X. Well, that X matters, and it's determined on, well, how much of the problematic kind of climate emissions have you got at the moment on your book? What is the context of your business? There's research being released recently to say that investors actually at the moment just care whether there is somebody who's ticked the box and says, yes, we're reducing emissions, but they're not necessarily scrutinizing the degree to which they are reducing emissions by, and they're not pricing that in. It is therefore going to be incumbent upon regulators in some way to be able to hold feet to the fire by having that context-based goal. Flexibility, lean and agile. We are finding things out every day. Even in the clean technologies of electric vehicles, just wait until the news stories of 2027 break about what deep ocean mining looks like. This is a good reason for why financial institutions need to, right now, not just eventually, be in the Corporate Sustainable Due Diligence Directive, because things will change. We are only an innovation away from some brilliant group in a university from the entire transition pathway, which is only a narrative, being completely rewritten for a sector. That is always the case. That is how disruption has always worked. It is how disruption is going to work. That is one of the only constants. Why would it be sensible, therefore, to write 3-year plans? That doesn't necessarily make sense. How do we make things a continuous process for the betterment of the banks, as well as being able to control it across the economy? And they need to be granular and specific. I saw a comment in the chat saying, but don't we need to still, be in fossil fuels a bit because we can't phase out straight away? We need to be 100% more specific and granular. If we are saying banks should not be financing the expansion, but can still be involved with those companies if they are financing the transition, there are things called corporate lawyers who will help with that. Banks can call the shots on structures. They need to be doing that. What we're seeing now from some of the leaders, so Danske Bank recently said they will no longer renew facilities for corporate facilities for energy companies who are expanding fossil fuels. How do they do that? They use corporate lawyers to write that into contracts. So that you've got this kind of mechanism of being very specific about how you're doing the targeting. It is not sufficient to say we have a transition plan because we have intermediate targets. If you don't change anything about the mechanisms, about how you're aligning your incentives, about how you're doing your due diligence, about how you're looking at your 3 horizons, then nothing is likely to change over the long term, no matter how many interim targets you have. To round off, Stuart Kirk famously said, well, why should we worry about bank loans because to fossil fuels, because they're only 6 years long. So, by year 7, we can be in and out of them. Right now, in terms of the materiality point, financial regulators need to be really worried about that because it is undermining financial stability. And what we need to make sure is that not only are the financial regulators marking the homework alongside their scientific advisors, but they're holding the pen on the systemic transition plan. How is the entire system going to work out? Because if we allow banks to write loans where they say we've managed our risks predominantly by basically fly tipping them into the rest of the market, that is a classical commons problem where the system is not being transitioned, and they need to feel the empathy by holding the pen on that systemic transition plan. That's what I will propose, apart from to say that we have a lot of other resources on trying to set out some of the practical tools under something called the Good Transition Plan, which was a crowdsourced document. Thank you look forward to the questions in the discussion.
Thank you very much, James Vaccaro, also for the systemic approach of this topic. It's not only the individual bank, it's the whole system that needs to change. I now want to give the floor to our last speaker, which is Ms. Gerdy Kneep. She's project manager at the Sustainable Finance Lab, an international initiative which aims at bridging science and practice for sustainable finance. So it's a very nice continuation with the previous speaker. She deals with various topics surrounding the sustainability of private financial sector with a focus on the banking sector and pension funds. She worked already as a senior sustainability manager at Deloitte. Gerdy is also an expert in the Dutch climate commitment. Floor is yours.
Yes, thanks, Jan, for the introduction. And thanks for having me here. It's great to see a big group of people interested in this important topic. So we already heard quite a bit about the concept of transition plans, the importance of a good transition plan, and also how regulation can help making these plans more robust and reliable. And also the importance of linking these plans to the overall strategy. So I will reflect a bit on developments in the Netherlands specifically, and how Dutch banks perform in terms of their climate commitments and transition plans. So maybe first some context to set the scene a bit. So in the Netherlands we have the Dutch climate commitment, which was established in 2019. All large financial institutions in the Netherlands actually committed to contribute to the Paris goals. And part of this commitment was to report on financed emissions and to prepare transition plans before 2022. So at that time, the Dutch financial sector was actually quite ahead. Also last year, The sector itself published guidance on what they believe should be part of a transition plan. The end of last year, KPMG conducted an independent review on the transition plans of the Dutch financial institutions. And this was debated in the Dutch government in March this year. Our Minister of Finance was overall quite happy with the progress. However, she did mention points of attention, being the level of detail, the level of ambition, and also the comparability. And the governance around the actions of implementing the plan. And she also pointed out that an acceleration is needed in terms of the climate transition, and that she is exploring additional regulation for climate change and for transition plans. And actually, we expect a consultation document next month. So I think that's quite an interesting development in the Netherlands. I'm very curious what comes out of it. And also how it will link to the European developments. So the SREP, the CSRD, and the CRD Directive, which we already discussed. Then a bit about what we observe in the transition plans of the Dutch banks. Maybe interesting to mention the Eerlijke Geldwijzer, which is a Dutch NGO, also conducted a review this year on the climate plans, and their conclusion was actually quite strong. So they were not happy, saying the plans are not ambitious enough and not robust. Some points they mentioned that the plans don't cover all asset classes, where Anushka also already referred to. Banks don't have concrete plans to phase out fossil fuels, and actions being not in line with the goals. They actually reviewed and scored the plans individually, so quite interesting to have a look into that report. And also at Sustainable Finance Lab, we looked into some of the transition plans of the larger Dutch banks. And in general, we see it's positive banks have provided plans, and also that they extended the scope and level of detail with respect to earlier plans. But we also saw points of improvements, also in line with some of the points which were already discussed today. First of all, the scope is limited, so not all activities are included. The reduction targets are mostly defined on a relative level rather than an absolute level. So that's more about the methodology of the targets. And it's also unclear whether the described actions will actually lead to the desired results. So maybe a bit more about the scope. So we actually observed that 38% of the institutions that signed the climate commitment report emissions of less than 90% of their relevant assets, where on average 70% of the assets is marked as relevant. So a lot of numbers, but it actually means a significant proportion of the assets is just not taking into account, and emissions are just not reported. And also there is unclarity, or at least large differences in what banks see as relevant asset categories. So for example, real estate, private equity, and project finance is not always marked as relevant. Whereas we know that these asset classes can actually have significant emissions. That's about emissions reporting, but if we look at the scope of reduction targets and plans, we also see large differences. So, for example, one of the larger Dutch banks has reduction targets for only 20% of their corporate portfolio. So that's really not a lot. I see a comment in the chat, and I will share the reports. So we'll do that later. Then a bit more about the definition or the methodology of the targets. I think James also shortly referred to this already. But what we observe is that banks typically use a combination of relative targets and absolute targets for different asset classes or sub-portfolios, and also different scenarios and methodologies. So it seems that they're also still searching what sort of works best. But it makes it very difficult to compare and also to judge whether banks are actually on the right track. And we also know that they're not right. So several studies, including a recent study from the Dutch Central Bank, show that banks are not on the right track to meet the Paris goals, and actually that they're underestimating their transition risks. So we believe that at a minimum, absolute targets should be defined. I mean, in the end, it's all about reducing absolute emissions in the global economy. Also because otherwise, volume effects can give a wrong picture. So for example, there was one large Dutch bank which actually showed sort of good performance on all their asset classes in terms of aligning with Paris. Only for their aviation portfolio during COVID period, they showed a mismatch since the airplanes were less occupied. So although overall emissions in the sector actually reduced during COVID times, which is positive, the relative emissions, so the emissions per passenger, showed a deviation from the Paris goal. So this can also give sort of a wrong presentation. And of course, relative targets can be helpful to show, for example, technological progress. But absolute targets are important as well. Then a bit about the actions. So I think we already talked a bit about the importance of having clear actions to actually meet the goals. And the plans actually do describe actions, but the effectiveness of these actions is often not substantiated. So banks, for example, do not explicitly describe what they need from governments, although we know they definitely need support there. And they also do not describe what additional actions are considered in case the described actions are simply not enough. And also there's a lack of short-term actions, for example, in 2025 already. So an example of a short-term action could be around deforestation. As we know, the Dutch banks are heavily connected to deforestation activities. And of course, this is also good for other goals like biodiversity and restoring nature. So to conclude, the Dutch financial sector definitely made progress in terms of extending their reports, but there are definitely challenges and more is needed to meet Paris goals. So we actually really welcome the plan of the Dutch Minister of Finance to come with additional regulation to speed up the process and to make plans more robust, reliable, and also comparable. And hopefully the sector can then become a leader again in defining clear criteria for these transition plans.
Okay,
so
thank you.
Happy to address any questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, Gertie. Well, that was the last of the 4 talks we had this afternoon. I see a number of questions arising. More interestingly enough, last week we had more participants and less questions. Now we have more questions and less participants. Maybe we could derive a hypothesis from that, but we won't do that today. First of all, I'll put a question myself on the floor, and it has some connection with the expose of Gertie. Thing is, many of you have said that this new system implies a lot of capacity, a lot of technicality, a lot of know-how, new know-how, expertise that is not there where it should be. And some member states are front runners, others are, I suppose, lagging behind. Has any of you an idea of what the situation is? What would be the receptivity in the member states for adapting this new system? How strong would it be, or how weak would it be? What should be done? Has any of you an idea on this? Because it's on the practicality of the system, whatever it would be.
Do you mean with accepting the system, sort of accepting and adopting new regulation?
Yes, indeed. So
Yeah.
the front runners, of course, they have experimented themselves, so they have some know-how at the government level, and they involved some banks, I suppose, etc. Others haven't done anything until now, I suppose.
Yeah.
Have you an idea how the situation is in Europe as in the broadness of the 27 member states?
Yeah. I mean, I don't have a view on all the member states, but I think in the Netherlands, well, as mentioned, our Ministry of Finance is in favor of additional regulation on climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not only on transition plans, but also they're also exploring regulation on engagement, for example. And also we know that the Dutch Central Bank is really in favor of having additional regulation to include climate risk into the supervisory framework. So that's a bit more on the outside-inside, as we talked about, but it also relates to the other side of the double materiality. For example, what the DNB is now putting on the table is concentration limits. So actually introducing limits to certain sectors on how much they can invest into, for example, fossil fuels or another carbon-intensive sectors. And that is something they just openly disclose, that they are sort of pushing for that in the European debate of central bankers.
Okay, thank you. And Thierry, you have been member of the board of the French Financial Markets Authority. So you have met your colleagues, I suppose, around Europe?
That's a good assumption.
So can you comment? Of course, it's a bit delicate, but can you comment on this?
No, well, no, I don't think it's delicate. I think it's a very, very good question, and it's a very fair point. And that goes beyond the question of transition plans. This is true for everything that has to do with sustainable finance. We collectively, once again, have a big challenge of know-how, experience, capability of regulators and supervisors. And yes, some countries, I'm not here to to give grades, so it doesn't really matter who is better, who is not quite as good. But it's a fact that some countries are more advanced than others. But in my view, even in these so-called more advanced countries, there's still a lot of work to be done. And when you look at transition plans, the reality is that I don't think that supervisors, I'll go very far, any of them are really equipped today to do the job. I mean, you have some very, very good, let's stay with the good ones. I mean, take central banks. There's a number of central banks. Take the Dutch central bank. They were the first one to do climate stress tests. Could argue about what the result was, but they were the first ones. Bank of England is doing a phenomenal job. In my country, there's been a lot of work as well. And there's many other countries, and Belgium is doing some interesting things as well. So many countries are really, and I'm missing many. So it's not a case of saying this is better, this is not good, blah blah blah. Even in those countries, and if I speak and for the country I know best, you'll guess which one it is. Despite all the investment into training people, into hiring the good people, with supervisors and everything, a lot remains to be done. And supervisors, and it's quite understandable, are reluctant to get into some of the debates that are beyond their own competence, because their competence is about, at the end of the day, checking financial matters, checking that information is correct, that the information given is accurate, it's not misleading, those sort of things. But at one point, the question is not so much about, well, it is about, are you doing what you're saying you're doing? And supervisors are reasonably well equipped to check that. But the question at one point is what you're doing impactful? Does it make a difference? Is it what needs to be done? And there, I don't think supervisors are equipped to do that. And I'm not pointing fingers, it's a fact. So, and that's really also, by the way, very close behind is the question of greenwashing. And there's two conceptions of greenwashing here. Are you doing what you're saying you're doing, or is what you're doing impactful? And what I'm saying here is that, we can probably address the first question and not so well the second one. And it's even worse in some countries, which for a number of reasons, and we all have our reasons, are not quite as well equipped. So that's a big challenge. And when you see, the text currently being negotiated by the EU co-legislators, talking about supervision, talking about, competent authorities, national competent authorities, it remains very vague as to who will be actually doing it. All that put in context also of limited public budgets for everybody. I mean, public budgets are very limited. So, say, a lot of money comes in with supervisors. Well, they hire the right people, build their competence and everything. Well, it's not the real world. The real world is, not one more cent because we don't have any public money for you.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
Big challenge, big challenge.
Thank you, Thierry. Anushka, you want to comment as well?
Yes, I think I liked James' sentence who said central banks are not scientific organizations. And I think they should not supposed to be scientific organizations. They should do their job, right? So there's two things that we do in order to make sure that they have the right competencies for the job they need to do, and then that we put in place a system that makes sure that the job is done. And so I think one area here is clearly, and you said, do they have competences? They're massively building up competences. I think that we can say, probably, as Thierry said, not kind of in a harmonized way, but there is massive investment in internal competences. What we still need is probably a better collaboration with scientific organizations in order to make sure these they stay up to date. And as James said, things are changing rapidly, and what you're always kind of the next innovation is going to change the transition pathway. So we need to have a continuous dialogue. But it is, we do have scientific organizations and we should probably make better use of them. So creating a better discussion with them, with the environmental agencies, with the advisory councils, with universities, meteorological organizations. We have everything, we have the knowledge, right? So better collaboration is probably necessary. And then on the other hand, what is the job of supervisors and central banks? And when we, for example, what we probably would need for the transition plans, as James also said, we need a script of how to build a credible transition plan. And then we need some kind of police. And we have auditors of all kinds, right? So if we had a standardized script of how to build this credible transition plan, as well as accredited auditors that can do that verification on a micro level, then actually the work that banks need to do and bank supervisors need to do is massively reduced. So we should not ask banks and supervisors to do the whole job, but we need to build the system as we've done in other areas. And what we also need to build is to build a clear structure of how these different transition plans at different levels actually build upon, because we have EU climate targets, we have national climate strategies of different quality, probably none that is perfect. What we need and what is under discussion in some countries at least, and I hear probably also at European level, is the question of sectoral transition plans, which I think is a very key missing piece. Because if we talk about today company level transition plans, we need to understand how the sector as a whole is going to develop in order to understand if that company transition plan is a credible fit into that sectoral transition, which should be part of a bigger picture of the national level, which then feeds into how the EU as a whole is managing its transformation. So we need these different levels. We need to have them in an integrated way that they speak to each other. So there's a whole number of actors that we need to mobilize in order to create this multi-level system. And the knowledge is there. What we need is to create the different levels and make sure they work and speak to each other, and that the different levels of regulation actually also then create a harmonized whole.
Thank you. Very impressive. And we will write it all down because it's a number of ideas. Thierry, you asked the floor once again, and then I give the floor to James to comment. Thierry?
Yes, thank you very much. 2 points. It's not only a question of competence of supervisors, but also of data. When we hear and when we see that transition plans should be part of the supervisory review and evaluation process of banks, in principle, this is excellent. This is what should be done. And I agree with Anushka when she said that. Having said that, when you look at the way SREP operates, if you don't have the data, nothing happens. Because the reality of the process is that you have a supervisor sitting down with a supervised entity and saying, okay, show to me that what you're doing and your risk management process and the way you manage your risk and the capital you have to manage your risk is sufficient given the risk you're taking. And in order to prove that in one direction or the other, you need the data. And by definition, when it comes to climate change, we don't have the data. We have very partial data. You know, this is a forward-looking event. It's not, you know, it's not behind us. So, and I hate to say that, you know, I can already anticipate the conclusion of these discussions, which run the risk of saying, look, we don't have the data, so we'll talk again when we have it. But in my view, when we have it, it might be too late. The other thing is, I completely agree with Anushka when she said sectoral transition plans are absolutely essential, which is why in the work being done at so-called level 2 of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is, and the level 2 is actually the writing of the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, which is the job being done by EFRAG at the moment. When I say job being done by EFRAG is reflecting on the subject, making proposals, and the Commission makes the legislative proposal. Obviously, EFRAG is not the legislator, and which is why we absolutely need sectoral standards, because those sustainability reporting standards were designed to have sector agnostic standards, sort of, you know, the general rules for everybody. And then you dive into the specificities of the retail sector and the oil sector, and you name it, whichever sector you want to take. And then you say, okay, if we stick to transition plans, okay, transition plan for a retailer should look like this, or the reporting should look like this, and for the oil sector, it should look like that. And obviously, I cannot resist, you know, the temptation of mentioning the fact that currently the European Commission is telling us, it's public, you know, knowledge, that sectoral standards will be delayed, and that they will be written and possibly adopted later, whenever that means. And that is very, very, very worrying, because not only we need them in absolute terms, but sector agnostic standards, if they're adopted on their own, are like a lame duck. You know, there's, you know, it's you have a missing leg, and if you have a missing leg, you're not going to be running very fast. Not to mention the fact that we're still waiting for the agnostic sector agnostic standards to be proposed in the form of a legislative delegated act.
Okay, thank you. Anushka, you wanted to comment, but suddenly you don't want to comment anymore?
Yeah, I want to comment, but I will leave maybe because
Okay.
there's many questions. Let's take some questions.
James, do you want to comment? And then we go to the questions because there's a number of them. Eh?
Yeah, just super briefly. I mean, I think that in a way we all come from quite similar perspectives, so it's quite hard to fight. So I'm trying hard to generate some I think that when you're talking about banks, banks have got the least credible excuse for data deficiencies because they can quite literally ask a client for anything. They need if you're writing a credit proposal, you want to know, you can ask anything. You can got access all areas. You've got the money until it's dispersed. If you know fine well that you can get hold of the data and you can dig down as far as you want to go to satisfy yourself. The question is, well, how far are we having that sort of whole level playing field so that you're not sort of seen as the ones being too rigid and therefore pushing yourself out of the market? I think sector transition plans are can be useful, but they're just narratives and they're stories which can be disrupted tomorrow. We'll no doubt get a sector transition plan out of COP28, which has got full of lots of science which will enrage us on carbon capture and storage. It's just a story. And it has its kind of downsides. So I think that, you look at the taxonomy was supposed to be the one single point of truth to be able to take away discrepancies. There's now about 45 taxonomy processes around the world, and they're all disagreeing with each other because they've become very highly politicized. Sector strategies and sector pathways will be politicized. There's one tiny thing in terms of strategy I want to mention, and that is that we also need to think about, well, what is the mechanism, the natural incentive to want to be able to do transition plans as well. And I think Anushka, in yours, you said, well, at the moment, it's only kind of punishment. You put it out there, you've got all the work in doing it, and it's like people just can beat you up over it. I think that there are certain things which will make a flip. When I was speaking with some of the banks who are making these transitions, like Danske Bank making this transition from fossil fuel expansion, it requires a wholesale change to their strategy. They may lose some business on one end, so they're thinking, how do we really pivot to the green business lines to be able to make up that income? It requires wholesale strategies, and some of the market mechanisms, like the carbon border adjustment mechanism, is going to drive business, which is also going to drive financial flows. And whilst we in Europe maybe, and even more anachronistically in the UK, think that we dominate the world and the world plays by our rules, are less than 5% of the global population, so will not necessarily be the last word on trade mechanisms. Mm-hmm. Reading the Bank of Canada's report was saying that their current weighted average carbon intensity, 305 tons of carbon per $1 million. That's about double the US banking system, which is about double the European banking system, which is about double sort of the green banks system. It's so far out of line that they are saying we've got so much transition risk that for now it's almost a bit like rolling up a hill. It's like we're going to keep Canada back and sort of like make sure that the policies run out all of our debt facilities for the tar sands and all the things which they're doing in Canada. But at a certain point, when the rest of the world, through trade mechanisms, begins to punish those companies through real financial materiality, that flips very suddenly, and the forward progressive ones who've got credible transition strategies who are in the green sectors are going to benefit more. And that's a positive pull more than just the regulatory sort of stick.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's delve into the questions. We have not much time left, but anyway, there was one general question which took over my role. We will keep that for the last. And James answered it partly. Anything you feel you disagree with one of the other speakers, James said we all agree, apparently, so that's answered. And James also did something on, is there any reflection on the progress in the EU compared to that of outside of the EU, Asia and upcoming financial hotspots? Has anybody some comment on this? because it's a bit out of bond, but
I've been speaking a lot with other jurisdictions, and there's a lot of attention on what's happening in the Middle East because of COP28. I think in a way Europe has created this image for itself as like being the leader, and it was justified in terms of the early thinking, but now it is being taken hostage to fortune by sort of being used as a, well, if Europe isn't going to do that, why should we? If Europe with all of its prism isn't going to go there, then it's becoming almost sort of setting the lower watermark unless it keeps on driving things forward. And I think that there's some real tension as to like the green finance opportunity, about what's going to drive the green finance opportunity, and a lot of those require innovation to think about how to get the finance flows to where things are needed most, and that's going to be in mostly urban centers and emerging markets. That's where the green cities are going to be built. That's where the adaptation is going to be required. That's all of those kind of things I think are going to be broken. And I think that Europe sort of put itself on a platform, and it now has to live up to it. Otherwise, it's going to be sort of be used as the reason why others won't get there.
Interesting situation. Thank you. Then the question before is the kind of support banks need from governments. What are the lessons from the Netherlands and UK? Now, we have partly commented on this already, because knowledge institutions came into view, etc. But are there other lessons in the relation governments versus banks and support that can be told or said? Anushka, you are first, then James, then maybe CRD once again. Anushka?
I think we need to be cautious a little bit of what we can expect from banks, right? Banks cannot save the world against economic policies. So I think what is also meant here is that banks' action has limits. We know banks have levers of influence, and they should use them, but they cannot finance a transition that is not happening. So we need to, so I think what needs to be, we should not give the impression that by using financial regulation, we can make this transition happen alone. So we also need economic policies. We also need price signals. And I think there is some kind of tendency to say, oh, carbon pricing is difficult. We should just use financial regulation and then everything will be fine. And I think this definitely doesn't work. And this is probably also meant of what banks, a good way, and the threat process could also be part of that, because then supervisors can actually gather this information of where banks are hindered in financing this transition, and what can governments do in order to set the right price signals, in order to set targeted subsidies where they are really necessary, in order to come with public-private financing schemes where they are really necessary, because obviously public financing is limited, so we need to use this wisely. So we need banks to understand where they really have limits and where we can push them to, for example, in financing projects that are not as profitable as banks would like them to be, but that are still profitable. So probably banks can do a little bit more here, and then where projects are really not bankable, there we need the public sector. So I think there's a lot of things that banks actually can inform governments of how to better target their activities.
Okay, James?
It's a short build on that. I think that, I mean, that's true. I just maybe pick up on one thing in terms of profitability. Banks, it's not so much about the variability of margin, it's about how much volume you can put out. And actually the biggest opportunity will be in the green economy if you've got policy and governments which are really building the green sector. I think that what you see in particular with banks, and in particular with debt, in the South African instance, where you had banks pulling out of financing debt to coal plants, is that you choke the debt, it doesn't happen in the real economy. It's a very effective lever for change. But then you also need to have that backed up by the strategy. So in terms of the UK's green finance strategy, the major comment was, well, how can you be expecting finance to not be doing fossil fuels when the UK still wants to explore for new resources in the North Sea. You've got to eliminate those contradictions, and then you can let finance do its job and take its full responsibility.
So the main support is consistency, as I hear, at all levels, and sectoral policy we noted. CRD, which lessons have you learned?
Yeah, so I think a lot is said by Anushka and James already. But I think banks have a tendency to sort of point towards the government and saying, well, we cannot indeed state a transition, the government needs to do it. And that's, I guess, partly true. But what they can do is sort of make clear what they then need from the government. And then indeed it can be pricing, it can be setting standards, regulation, because banks are experts, right? They talk to their clients every day. They know the sector very well. So I think it's too easy to sort of say, well, it's not us, it's the government that needs to do something. Banks can do a lot themselves already, and they can make it very clear to the government what kind of help they would need in order to make these net zero plans.
They have their own responsibility and impact. There's also such thing as impact investment, by the way. Let's consider this as answered. Well, the general questions I keep for the latest. There are two questions that are related. One is we cannot full stop. No, it's the other one. Every speaker is talking about climate change and carbon reduction, but it's just one aspect. What about biodiversity and what about circular economy? Well, I would say, of course, but are there more comments on this? CRD, are you ready?
Yeah, I would also say, of course. I think the topic of today is climate change, and that's why we're all talking about climate. But definitely biodiversity, circular economy are very important topics as well. And they're also not sort of new topics or new themes. They're all interrelated, right? It's about us trying to live within planetary boundaries. And there's a lot of overlap between these topics as well. So I would always advise a financial institution to look at sort of their overarching strategy in terms of how they want to become more sustainable, taking all these topics into account. And I think on the regulatory side, there are definitely interesting developments as well. So the EU taxonomy, for example, is looking at the wider range of topics, including social topics. The TNFD, the Task Force of Nature-related Financial Disclosures, recently came with their final draft framework. It's not mandatory, but at least it gives guidance towards corporates and financial institutions on integrating nature, and also referring to, not sure if they call it nature transition plans, but at least something like that, really taking into account the double materiality concept as well. So I guess this is only the beginning, and yeah, definitely the other topics are equally important.
Okay, thank you. More comments, James?
Just to say, I mean, this is fully and squarely in the transition plan task force remit. I'm actually on the just transition and adaptation working group. There's a nature working group. So there's a number of things in terms of the environmental and social material kind of points which are important to on a macro scale for the financial system. I think this will be taken into consideration. What will help regulators from not going crazy is to have this mental model. In my view, it would be to have this mental model that it's all just different lenses on a corporate strategy. When you look at it in that way, you go, right, this is just an interrogation of their strategy. Let's understand the bits in terms of climate and nature and drill into it, just in the same way as a regulator would to drill into, well, what are you doing on financial crime? Or what are you doing in digital delivery? All those kind of elements. It's just another dimension. It's just got a different set of drivers and applications in terms of the world.
Thank you. Now I'll mix two questions and I'll put them to everybody of yours. One question was very general. What's your overall opinion on the CRD? Is it a big step forward? And what would you like to do differently? So have you one suggestion, prior suggestion on the CRD that you would like to do differently? And what about relations with the other directives that have similar purposes but are on other fields? So how do you see, how would you like to see it evolve if you haven't answered this yet? Who wants to take this up? One suggestion to do it differently.
We're sticking to transition plans here because CRD is much broader than.
Yes, yes, of course. We are sticking to Article 87A, etc.
Yeah. Okay. Two things. A, the different pieces of regulation have to speak to each other. CRD, Capital Requirement Directive, CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSDDD, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that you addressed last week in a webinar. Those three pieces of regulation, at the end of the day, speak about the same subject and are complementary with one another. If they don't speak to each other, if they don't use the same terms, we're braced for ambiguity, and ambiguity will lead us nowhere. I was mentioning the fact that in CRD, the word transition plan is not mentioned. Of course, you read the text and you think, "Oh, this is a transition plan, is it not?" But please use the words. It will help everybody. Are we sure we're talking about the same thing? I could, give you 20 examples of pieces of regulations in the, that effectively don't give the same definition to the same words. So this is not good. The other thing is distinguish very precisely and don't be ambiguous on what I was mentioning earlier, i.e., are you talking about transition plan to manage the risk, the financial risk on financial institution, or the impact on financial institutions and the institutions it is financing on the outside world? Be rigorous. So if you introduce those two distinctions, we'll have the background to be serious about the work and to avoid the ambiguity that will make all of us lose years and years and years, and we don't have the luxury of being able to lose those years.
Thank you very much for this clear message. You end where you started. Be rigorous, and that's very important. Thank you. Anushka?
Yeah, I completely agree with Thierry, and I think for the moment, what would I do differently? As Thierry said, some words are there, some words could be interpreted to go into the right direction, but they also could be interpreted in order to go into a completely different direction. So for the moment, we don't know the result of the trilogue and what will be the final words. So everything is still open at this point. So a complete ignorance of the climate impact of banks under the CRD is still possible and even somewhat likely. So because there are a lot of people that are probably somewhat afraid of how much of a big shift that would mean, and it would mean a big shift. Let's be clear, it would be a major reinterpretation of financial risk management and of what supervisors and central banks are supposed to do, and how far we actually have a say on what banks are financing or not. So it would be a major shift. Will we see that shift? It's completely open.
Yes, thank you. So this is also a very interesting point, but I just lost my thread now. So just sorry. So James.
I think that there's several things in terms of there's the CRD kind of element of what the regulators do within their existing paradigm. There's a bigger question in terms of, okay, we're at 2023 European Union. We have got serious climate risks already encroaching, not just in the places which we thought historically were going to be battered. It's going to start, it is happening now. Looking at those macro risks, is this a primary responsibility for our regulators? Do they need supplementary competencies because they're not scientists? Do we need much more clarity on what the responsibility level is? Because within this current paradigm, it's hard to see how too much radical will be changing. generally will take, you know, a couple of years from anything from proposal to get through. Those 2 years are the critical years when you look at the curve and the gradient of the curve that we would need to be able to reduce emissions to be able to reduce what to 1.5. It's colossal. The other key kind of factor from the science, I do some things on the review for IPCC, is that if you look at the time series of estimates from the IPCC, you notice something interesting. Firstly, that the risk of us going to the sort of the RCP 8.5, you know, 4 degrees kind of scenarios is reducing. But in the band where we probably are currently sort of like aimed, the sort of the 2 somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees, the impacts now are looking the same, if not worse, than what it was originally cast for that RCP 8.5. So we're heading towards even greater levels of impact for the areas which we once imagined were kind of out of possibility, and that has got huge systemic financial risks. So I think that the real kind of question is on the table of the finance ministers. It's great that, I mean, I think the Netherlands is now the co-president of the coalition of finance ministers on climate, to be able to knock heads together amongst the G7, the G20 on what does the mandate need to be, what does the architecture need to be, because what we have got now is not fit for purpose for this unfamiliar future which we're about to head into and have already stepped into.
Thank you very much, James. So Anushka pointed to the vulnerability of the decision process. Will we get to the quality we need? And you, James, you point to the vulnerability of the banking sector as a whole in the world that is coming on. Gerdy, I give you the last word.
I'm not sure if I have anything to add. So much was said already, and we are also
that's your last word.
Yeah. So yeah. Thanks,
okay.
everyone.
Okay, then I'll close this session just a few minutes late. It was a very interesting session. I had a lot of keywords on my paper, but that was the aim of the last round, that you gave your keywords, and as they have been given, you have summoned. You have given a summons of the whole session. I thank you very much, you all, the speakers, the intervenants in this discussion. I also want to thank Nathalie Bouquet and Volmer de Haan for organizing this session. I want to point to a seminar that our federal Belgian colleagues will be organizing the 23rd of May, which will be about the same topics. And we as a network of council, of advisory councils to governments, we will take up this thing further on, and we will try and advise our policymakers on this cloud of topics, because it's not one topic, it's a cloud of topics. We will take this up. This webinar will be on YouTube soon, and so I will definitely review it and try to grasp it better than even I did in the last 1.5 hours. And I suspect that all other listeners will do the same thing. So thank you very much. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.